Well, this was the point I was going to ask about, because it seems to me that if you're talking about the authority of the self, you could indeed lead to a moral anarchy, and a sincere and genuine concern for moral anarchy, a desire for an alternative to moral anarchy, then would logically lead to an extension of the authority of self to an institution of some form with which the individual identifies. And what you just described is a redefinition of an institution by an individual to preserve the authority of oneself, but to support it with the authority of an institution. And it seems to me that the authority of the institution is contradictory to the authority of the self, that the true existentialist is by his very nature an individual, fulfilled, a self-defined individual, and that he will by his very uniqueness not be able to identify himself with an institution. I mean, isn't there a contradiction here?
Well, as you see, I'm not speaking of the true existentialist. I'm not using the word existentialist in any particularly laudatory way. I'm simply using it, as I said in the beginning I would, as a label for particular thinkers. And it seems to me that what they are doing here is interesting and open to very severe criticism. What's interesting about it is that they don't really, in the end, find authority in an institution. That would be much less interesting. That would be much more commonplace. But Kierkegaard does not make his peace with the church. On the contrary, he wears himself out peddling pamphlets in which he attacks the church, collapses in the street, is carried in 1855 into a hospital. He wants the last sacraments. He is offered them by an ordained minister of the state church, and although he badly wants the sacraments, he dies without them rather than compromise with the institution. Similarly, Jean-Paul Sartre, characteristically and importantly, does not join the Communist Party, does not feel that he can really join any major institution, feels that he has to stand alone. Heidegger briefly in 1933, when Hitler came to power, joined the Nazi Party, but certainly what is characteristic for Heidegger is again the stands that he took alone after this brief, unfortunate, and to me very unpalatable flirtation with Nazism. He took his stands alone. It is never really a way of making any enduring peace with an institution, but what goes on is the subtle maneuver of what I call exegetical thinking, which is the subtle maneuver in which the thinker casts about for some prop to lean on, and, being a man of words, finds a text, finds texts, and then reads his own ideas in a very subjective way into the text, but as I've said, gets them back endowed with authority. And I'm not trying to say that this sort of exegetical thinking is confined to existentialism, but it is very interesting that people who start out so much as individualists and subjectivists and as enemies of bad faith and self-deception, in the end are driven into this kind of maneuver. I have tried to analyze this much more fully than I have done in these few words now in my book, Above Guilt and Fear, An Autonomous Morality. The word Doorphobia calls, I suppose, for some explanation, since I myself coined it. What I mean by it is the dread people have of making fateful decisions that will mold their own character and their future. And the existentialists, in a kind of a way, may be said to be aware of this dread, but alas, they also themselves suffer very much from this dread, and in the end, as I have tried to show, succumb to it. In the end, they do not manage to stand all alone and to examine carefully and critically their own position, as well as the alternatives that are open to them. But in the end, they shut their eyes. In their earlier phase, they are drawn to the extreme subjectivism of saying just choose anything as long as you choose it with a will. This doesn't involve considering the objections to one's own preferences. This doesn't involve taking a critical look at one's own convictions and preferences, nor does it entail any careful examination of alternatives. And then later on, when they descend into exegetical thinking and read their own ideas into the text and get them back endowed with authority, again, what they're doing is something that stops short of looking with open eyes at one's own position and at various alternatives. A quotation that I like very much is to be found in Nietzsche's notebooks, where Nietzsche once jotted down the following thought: a very popular error to have the courage of one's convictions, but what matters is to have the courage for an attack on one's convictions. And it seems to me that this very rare courage, the existentialist thinkers, alas, lack.
Professor Kaufmann, what do you foresee as being the legacy of the thinkers you have discussed and the works, the authors and works which you discussed?
I don't suppose that their legacy ultimately will be some one or two or three particular ideas, but since they're all writers, probably some books. In the case of Karl Jaspers, perhaps an important part of his legacy will be that he did coin a word for those extreme situations of which are made so much, and called them Grenzsituationen. And by coining a word for them, border situations, he moved them clearly into focus. How much anything of Heidegger's will last, I am not sure. I suppose if anything lasts, it will be his book Being in Time, which I suppose will continue to be discussed somewhat by philosophy professors for some time to come. But the great legacy of existentialism, I would think, certainly if we confine ourselves to 20th century existentialism, will be in the non-philosophical works of Jean-Paul Sartre. I think that he is one of the great writers of our time, and I would expect that some of his plays and his 5 short stories, and perhaps at least one of his novels, will last, and I think they deserve to last. And I expect that Sartre will go down in history like some other French figures before him, Montaigne, for example, and Rousseau and Voltaire, as not straight philosophers, but as people who were somewhere on the borderline between philosophy and literature. That is perhaps more a French phenomenon than an American one. Finally, there is still one thing about Sartre that strikes me as very significant about him, and that is that more than any other single individual in our time, I suppose he has spoken to the conscience of intellectuals, not only in his own country, in France, but all over the world, appealing quite especially to writers, artists, students, and professors to speak out against injustices, and particularly against war crimes committed by their own governments. He did that all during the Algerian War, and I rather expect that he reached the conscience of very large numbers of people in the United States also, and that the American reaction to the war in Vietnam owes a great deal to the influence of Jean-Paul Sartre.